My sister's engagement ring cost $88,000. I know the number because my mother said it twice at dinner, like it needed repeating, while I sat 3 seats down holding a coffee-stained white glove and a 200-year-old ledger nobody in my family had ever asked to see. "Say something nice, Nora," my mother said, not looking up from the ring. I said it was beautiful. It was. Camille held her hand out under the chandelier so the diamond would catch every bulb at once, and my father actually reached for his phone to take a photo, which he had not done at my college graduation, my library fellowship announcement, or the day, 6 months earlier, when I'd told them I might have found the missing half of a 140-year-old scientific discovery. Nobody at that table remembered that last part. I'd learned not to bring it up twice. I was 29, a rare books and manuscripts librarian at the Ellery Athenaeum in Boston. 5 years into a doctorate I was funding mostly myself, and the only person in my family who had ever cared what happened to a 19th-century astronomer's notebook. My nameplate at the reference desk said N. Winslow, in the same size letters as everyone else's, which was either equality or an oversight, depending on the day. My work was hard to make sound impressive at a dinner table. I traced handwriting, not signatures, those were easy and famous men signed everything they touched. I traced the other hand, the uncredited one, the one that turned up in the margins of a dozen scientific manuscripts from the 1880s, quietly correcting equations a celebrated astronomer named Elias Whitmore had gotten wrong, in a looping, left-slanted script that marked its most important corrections with the same small doodle, a 5-pointed star, drawn fast, like a habit, like something the hand did without deciding to. I'd found that star in 2 archives already, in 2 different states, in books that had never once been catalogued next to each other by anyone but me. It's slow work. You can't rush a hand. You have to sit with the same 5 letters, the same lowercase e, the same looping g, across a dozen different pages, different decades, different institutions that have never spoken to each other, until the letters stop looking like handwriting and start looking like a person clearing her throat. I called her the star privately because the record, where it acknowledged her at all, called her only JH, a housekeeper's daughter said to have helped copy things out neatly. I didn't think she copied things out neatly. I thought she found the mistakes a famous man missed, and let him keep the credit, because a woman correcting Elias Whitmore's math in 1884 could cost her family its whole position in an afternoon. My defense was 11 weeks away. I still didn't have her real name. My parents, Roger and Diane Winslow, were not unkind people. They were more precisely people who had decided, somewhere before I was old enough to notice, that fairness and equal love were 2 separate budgets, and there had only ever been room in the house for one. When we were 9 and 12, Camille got the flu bad enough for a hospital stay, and I got sent to my aunt's for 5 days so my parents could focus, and when I came home nobody asked how I'd done, they asked if I'd been good. I would learn, over the next 20 years, that those were never the same question. Camille was 26, marrying Preston Kimball that spring, and had never once in her life had to ask twice for anything. That wasn't her fault. It also wasn't mine that I'd spent our whole childhood being the daughter who didn't get sick, didn't get scared, didn't need extra attention, until I'd learned to stop needing things out loud around the same age Camille learned she'd never have to. I had spent my whole life being the guest who had to bring something to earn a seat at that table. Camille had never once had to check what she was carrying. I didn't resent her for the ring. I resented that my father had photographed it and not the ledger. Twice a week, I gave a lunchtime talk in the Athenaeum's reading room, open to the public, mostly attended by retirees and one teenager doing an extra credit project. And, for the last 4 months, by a man who always sat in the back row, always returned his loaner chair to the exact spot he'd found it, and always had already read whatever I'd put on the handout. The first time I assumed it was coincidence. The second time, when I mentioned an obscure 1886 Astronomical Society bulletin that wasn't in any digital archive, and he asked a specific, informed question about a table inside it, I stopped assuming. "You've already read that," I said once the room cleared. "It isn't digitized anywhere. I had to special request the physical copy." "I've got time," he said, like that explained anything. He had a library card older than mine, a habit of returning books a full day early, and a name Nolan Whitmore. That meant nothing to me, because I did not at the time think to cross-reference my crush against my own bibliography. He wasn't handsome in a way that announced itself. He was handsome the way a good sentence is good. You don't notice the craft until the third read, quiet, a little too still, hands that turned pages like the pages had asked him nicely. "Why do you keep coming?" I asked him once after the room had emptied and it was just the two of us and a case of 18th century sermons neither of us needed. "Because you talk about a woman who's been dead 140 years like she's running late for a meeting," he said. "I wanted to see if you were right about her." I'd understand much later, the truest thing he told me before he told me everything. I met Preston Kimball properly, at length, 3 weeks after the ring, at Sunday dinner. He was 34, up for tenure at a college 40 minutes outside the city, and had the specific charm of a man who has never once been the last person called on in a seminar. "Nora does old paper things," Camille told him, "the way you'd introduce a hobby, books and dust." "Manuscript provenance," I said. "I'm finishing a doctorate in it." "Right, the Star Lady." Preston smiled like remembering my work was a small gift he was giving me. Camille's mentioned it. "There's real hunger right now for recovered women of science narratives. Very timely." I did not love the word narrative, I did not say so. "What's your book on?" I asked because Camille had mentioned twice how brilliant his forthcoming manuscript was. "Overlooked contributors to 19th century American science," he said. "Broad canvas. I like to think big." Nobody at that table but me heard how closely that sentence walked beside my own dissertation abstract, filed with the graduate school 8 months earlier, sitting technically on a shared departmental research drive that Preston, as a visiting affiliate, had full access to. I told myself it was coincidence, overlapping fields do that sometimes. I was still telling myself that weeks later. Nolan had started walking me to the tea stop most Thursdays by then, never asking, just appearing beside me at the door with his coat already on. "You didn't have to wait," I told him the 4th time. "I know," he said. "I like the 11 minutes." He asked good questions and terrible ones in the same breath, wanted to know how ink oxidizes differently depending on its iron content, and also whether I'd ever been in love with someone I'd never met, because that was, he pointed out, basically what I described every week about a dead woman, with a star for a signature. "She's not a crush," I said. "She's a citation problem." "Sure," he said in a tone that meant he didn't believe me and didn't mind. He told me things in pieces, the way people do when they're deciding, in real time, how much of themselves to hand over, that he'd grown up outside the city in a house with more rooms than people. That there was a locked room upstairs nobody in 3 generations had been allowed to open, on account of some old family promise nobody living remembered the exact wording of anymore. That his family had money the way other families have a chronic illness, always present, rarely discussed, faintly embarrassing at holidays. "Must be nice," I said lightly, "the way you do." "It's really not," he said and didn't explain, and I didn't push, because I had my own locked room, a dissertation, 11 weeks, then 10, then 9 from defense, and everybody gets to keep one door closed. He told me the rest of it slowly, over the weeks that followed, the way you hand someone something breakable. That his father had once introduced him at a fundraiser as the last Whitmer who still reads, like it was a joke, like it wasn't the loneliest sentence Nolan had ever been handed in public. That he'd spent his 20s dating women who found out who his family was within a week and never quite recovered from finding out, one way or another. That he'd started going by his mother's maiden name on dating apps, and then stopped going on dating apps altogether, and started, instead, going to lectures about dead women nobody had bothered to name. "You never once asked what I did for a living," he told me, like it still surprised him. "You never once volunteered it," I said. "I figured you'd tell me eventually, or you wouldn't, and either way I liked the parts of you I already had." "That," he said, "is the single most dangerous thing anyone's ever said to me." I kissed him first, in the reading room, over a box of shipping manifests that smelled like 100 years of other people's holidays, and he went very still for a second, like a man deciding whether something good was actually allowed to be happening to him. "I've been coming here 4 months, he said afterward, forehead against mine. "You could have done that in month 1. You could have said something in month 1. "I was working up to it," he said. "I work slowly, ask any of my books." Dr. Okafor, Adiz, though I only ever called her that once, by accident, in a moment of relief so total I forgot my manners, was the only adult in my life who asked about my research the way you'd ask about a person you actually liked. She kept a drawer of protein bars for students who forgot to eat, and a low tolerance for anyone who called a woman's uncredited labor a narrative. You'll find her, she told me once, over coffee she'd made in her office because the department machine was broken again. You have the kind of stubborn that finds things. I've watched you cross-reference a smudge for 6 hours. What if Preston finds her first? Not her. A version of her. A nicer, faster, more marketable version. Then you'll have found the true one, and he'll have found a rumor with better publicity, she said. That's not nothing, Nora, but it isn't the same thing, and eventually people notice the difference. I wanted to believe her. For a while, I still could. I found the third star not long after, in a converted carriage house behind a small historical society outside Philadelphia, in a box that hadn't been opened, according to the accession log, since 1974. It took 2 trains, a rental car, and a research grant that covered exactly 1 hotel night to get there, and it took 4 hours on a cold floor before I found it. A single equation, corrected in the margin of a weather log nobody had thought was worth digitizing, the star drawn fast in the corner like she was already reaching for the next page before she'd finished this one. I called Nolan from the parking lot, because by then I called Nolan about everything. Read me the correction, he said, the actual numbers. I read him 6 lines of 19th century atmospheric pressure calculations over a bad cell connection outside a historical society in Pennsylvania, and he listened to every one like it was the ending of a novel he'd been saving. She's real, I told him. She's not a theory anymore. She's a person who sat in a cold room in 1884 and caught a mistake that would have embarrassed a man for the rest of his career, and she never told anyone. I know the feeling, Nolan said, and didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't push, because by then I'd learned that the things he didn't explain were usually the things that mattered most. Some nights we didn't talk about us at all. He'd sit across the reading room table with his own legal pad, cross-referencing dates against a shipping ledger I couldn't make sense of, and I'd look up an hour later to find he'd built me a cleaner timeline than the one in own dissertation draft. You're better at this than you let on, I told him once. I had a good teacher, he said. She gives lunchtime lectures on Thursdays, free to the public. It was the closest he ever came, before the end, to telling me the truth in broad daylight, and I laughed instead of hearing it, because I still thought I was the only one in the room with something to prove. The blow landed at what Camille called a combined celebration, her bridal shower, because Preston liked efficiency. His book deal announcement folded into one Sunday so my parents would only have to rearrange the good china once. Preston stood before dessert and read 2 paragraphs from his book's opening chapter, to warm applause. It described a woman known only by her initials in the archival record, uncredited corrections in the margins of a male scientist's papers, and he said this part with real relish, a small, recurring mark, almost like a signature that I like to think of as her way of refusing to disappear. I did not have a fork in my hand or I would have put it down too hard. He had never once heard me use the word star out loud. I had never published it anywhere. It existed in exactly 2 places, my private research notebook, and a shared folder on the department drive I'd been told, months earlier, by an overworked administrator, was restricted to current doctoral candidates and their committees. Isn't that wonderful, my mother said, to me specifically, like she was reminding me to clap. Preston's going to make this his whole first book. That's my dissertation, I said. Quietly, I want that on the record, I said it quietly. Nora, historians borrow from each other's questions all the time, Preston said, with the patient smile you'd give a child who didn't understand how grown-up things worked. Try not to make this about ownership. Nora, my father using the voice reserved for when I was being difficult. It's a big field. Lots of people are interested in this women's history thing right now. He used a word I invented. Honey, my mother, softer, worse. Are you sure you're not just feeling a little sensitive with everything going on with Camille? This is her season. Camille didn't say anything. Camille looked at her cake. I put my napkin down, said I had a headache, and left before dessert, and nobody at that table followed me outside. Nolan found me on the Athenaeum steps 20 minutes later because I'd texted him one word, outside, and he had, apparently, broken several traffic laws to get there. He used your word, Nolan said, not a question. I hadn't told him what happened yet. How did you? Camille called him brilliant in front of you like it was a compliment for the whole table. I've watched you flinch at that word for 4 months. I did the math. I laughed, which surprised us both because I'd been fairly sure I was about to cry instead. I don't have proof, I said. I have a feeling and a word he's never supposed to have heard. Then we get proof, Nolan said, and there was something in the way he said we that I filed away and didn't look at too directly, the way you don't stare straight into a bright window. He didn't offer to fix it, he didn't tell me it would be fine. He sat with me on a cold stone step and let me be furious out loud for 11 minutes, and when I was done, he handed me an actual, folded handkerchief like a man out of one of the books I studied and said, "For what it's worth, the star was always yours. He just borrowed the good part and left you the debt." There had already been one quiet resignation from Written Out's early manuscript review committee that same stretch, over what department gossip called sourcing disagreements. Nobody thought to ask what that meant. I certainly didn't, not yet. I had my own fires to worry about. The rumor started small, the way rumors do when someone wants deniability. A colleague mentioned kindly that she'd heard I was going through something personal that might be affecting my objectivity about a certain historian's new book. Another asked, not unkindly, if it was true I was involved with a private collector who had a stake in how the research turned out. I traced both rumors back to the same dinner party, the same mouth, the same careful, deniable phrasing Preston used for everything. He never said a false thing about me. He just arranged true things into a shape that made me look unstable, and let people finish the sentence themselves. I gave a conference paper that season, my first real one, 20 minutes to an audience of maybe 40 people in a hotel ballroom that smelled like old coffee and new carpet. Preston sat in the third row, taking notes, nodding at exactly the right moments, and afterward told me, in front of two people I didn't know, that my framework was really coming along. A woman I didn't recognize came up to me afterward and asked if I'd seen Professor Kimball's forthcoming book announcement. I said I had. She said she couldn't wait to see how the two projects talked to each other. I smiled the whole drive home. I did not feel like smiling even slightly. Camille came to find me alone once around then at my apartment without Preston, which she almost never did anymore. She sat on my kitchen counter the way she used to when we were teenagers and asked me quietly if I was happy for her. Really happy, not performing it. I want to be, I told her, which was the truest thing I could say without lying. He's not what you think, she said, and for 1 second I thought she meant it as a warning. Then she kept talking about how considerate he was, how he'd noticed things about her nobody else had, and I understood she meant it as reassurance, and that she believed every word, and that believing it was the only way she knew how to love someone. I didn't tell her about the star. I told myself I was protecting her. Some of that was true. Some of it was that I still didn't entirely trust she wouldn't mention it to Preston by accident, and I hated myself a little for being right later, when it mattered. Written Out came out to a genuinely lovely write-up in a major newspaper, calling Preston a rare historian with real narrative instinct. I read it 4 times, standing in the stacks, before I could make myself stop. He'd changed enough dates, a location, the name he used for her, that a casual reader would never connect it to anything. But I wasn't a casual reader. I was the only reader alive who'd recognize my own footnotes wearing somebody else's name. Camille would tell me much later what one particular conversation had actually looked like around that same time. Preston, working late at their kitchen table, asking, casually, how my defense prep was going. Camille, half distracted with a seating chart, mentioning that I seemed stressed, that I'd apparently found something new and promising, some old family archive, though she didn't really understand the details and didn't think it mattered much. Preston, not looking up from his laptop, asking one more easy question, gently, the way you'd ask about anything. Whose family archive exactly? I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew that an email arrived from Dr. Okafor a few weeks later, forwarding a concern raised anonymously through the graduate ombudsperson, questioning whether my central archival claim was independently verifiable, or possibly influenced by outside romantic involvement with a private collector. A sentence so specifically worded it could only have come someone who already knew about Nolan, and knew I hadn't yet found the ledger that would prove any of it. I had told exactly 3 people that Nolan's family might have an archive somewhere. Camille was one of them. I didn't confront her yet, I wanted badly to be wrong. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in June. My defense, after the concern, was quietly rescheduled to the far side of Preston's publicity tour. Every date in my life that season belonged, somehow, to somebody else's calendar. I told Nolan about the email one night, in the reading room, after closing, surrounded by boxes of 18th century sermons that had started to feel like old friends. Someone thinks I fabricated her, I said, or that you did for me, which is somehow worse. He was quiet a long moment, turning a pencil over the way he did when he was deciding something. Do you think she ever signed her actual name somewhere? He asked, not the star. Her name, somewhere she thought no one important would ever look. If she did, it'd have to be somewhere completely private, I said. A diary, a family Bible, somebody's personal papers that never got donated anywhere public. Yeah, he said very quietly, looking at his hands instead of at me, that makes sense. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It's the obvious question, anyone invested enough would ask it. I only understood much later that he'd been asking my permission for something he'd already half decided to do, and I'd answered him without knowing I'd been asked. The rehearsal dinner was 9 days before the wedding, and by then Written Out had been out for weeks, translated into 2 languages, and Preston had done a podcast tour where he talked, unprompted, about protecting the integrity of the historical record, which was the single most audacious sentence I had ever heard a man say out loud. My mother sat me down beforehand, actually sat me down, hands on my hands the way she used to when I ran a fever as a kid, and asked me please, for Camille's sake, not to bring up the Preston thing at dinner. He stole my work, I said. You don't know that, she said. And even if some of it overlapped, is this really the hill, Nora? Your sister is getting married in 9 days. So I'm supposed to just let it happen, again. I'm asking you to be generous, my mother said, the way you've always been. That was the sentence that finally did it, not the ring, not the newspaper, the word again, sitting quietly inside her sentence like she hadn't noticed she'd just confirmed there'd been a first time. I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice, I said okay, and I meant it, just not the way she thought I did. I went to the reading room that night instead of home, because it was the only room left that had never once lied to me. Nolan was already there, the way he always was, the way I'd stopped questioning months ago without ever asking why a man with his own library card kept sitting in a public one. I told him everything, the review, the postponed defense, my mother's again, Preston's careful, lovely, stolen sentences. I need her real name, I said. Not the star, not JH. A name I can put in front of a committee that isn't just my word against a book with a cover and a launch party. Nolan was quiet long enough that I thought I'd overwhelmed him. Then he stood and held out his hand, not romantically, practically, the way you'd offer to help someone carry something heavy. I need to show you a room, he said. And I need to tell you who I am first, because I should have done that months ago, and I let myself not, because I liked being someone you wanted without it. His full name was Nolan Elias Whitmore, his great-great-great-grandfather was Elias Whitmore. The locked room upstairs was not a quirky family embarrassment, it was his ancestors' private papers, sealed under a stipulation in Elias Whitmore's own will, one the family had followed for 4 generations without fully understanding it. The collection was not to be shown to any scholar, historian, until such time as a claimant establishes, to the family's satisfaction, the identity of Miss J.H. He knew, I said, he knew there was someone else, and he let the world call it his whole life. I think he knew, and was a coward about it his whole life, and hoped somebody braver would finish what he couldn't, Nolan said. I've spent 4 years trying to figure out how to open that room to the right person instead of the loudest one. You're not the first historian I've sat in the back row for, you're the first one who made me forget why I was there. The house had partially burned decades after Elias's death, he told me on the drive out, a wiring fire, contained mostly to the east wing, and family legend held that his great-great-grandmother had nearly lost her mind, making sure the insurance adjuster's inventory was airtight. Terrified the fire marshal would use the disaster as an excuse to force the sealed room open. Nobody in the family had thought about that old inventory in decades. I filed it away without knowing yet that it would save my life. The room, when he finally unlocked it, smelled like every good archive smells. Dust, old leather, time behaving itself. We opened 4 wrong boxes first, ledgers of horse feed, a decade of unremarkable correspondence, a box of pressed flowers that made us both go quiet for a different reason entirely. Then, in a bundle of shipping receipts and household accounts, a slim calculation notebook in a looping, left slanted hand, corrections marching down its margins, each one signed at the bottom in small, careful letters clearly written by someone who never expected anyone to read that far. Josephine Hale, her hand, her hours, her due. I sat on the floor of a room that hadn't been opened since before my grandparents were born and cried the way you cry when 140 years finally exhales. Josephine Hale, I said out loud to the room, to Nolan, to nobody. Her name was Josephine Hale. Hi, Josephine, Nolan said, very softly, like he was introducing her to me properly. This is Nora. She's been looking for you a long time. We spent the next 4 days at his kitchen table with the notebook between us, photographing every page, cross-referencing every equation against the published record, building the kind of airtight, boring, meticulous case that no one could wave away as romance. Nolan made coffee at hours no coffee should be made. I fell asleep twice with my cheek on someone else's century-old paper, and woke up both times to find he draped his coat over my shoulders instead of waking me. It was, without question, the best 4 days of my adult life. I didn't know yet that they were about to become the 4 days someone would try to use against me. I should have known better than to think the story ended on the easy exhale. Stories like mine never do. They end on the exhale, and then one more gut punch, just to make sure you meant it. Camille let it slip to Preston, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way you mention things to the person sharing your bed, that I'd suddenly turned up new evidence days before my rescheduled defense. Preston, who had built an entire book tour on being first, did not take that news generously. He didn't come after me directly, he was too careful for that. He went to my committee instead, 3 days before my defense, with a formal letter suggesting a conveniently timed discovery, surfacing from the private, unverified holdings of an undisclosed romantic partner, deserved significant academic skepticism, and that the university had an obligation to investigate the notebook's authenticity before it went anywhere near a defense. Dr. Okafor called me the night before. I have to ask you formally, she said, and I could hear how much she hated asking. Is there any chance at all, that document was created recently, for you? Check the provenance, I said. Don't take my word, check it. I hung up and didn't sleep because for one long terrible night, even I could hear how convenient it sounded. Nolan came over anyway, unasked, and sat with me on my kitchen floor because neither of us could stand the idea of a couch, and didn't try to talk me out of the fear. What if it's not enough, I said. What if 140 years of being right isn't enough, because I fell in love with the person who happened to be holding the proof? Then we find something that has nothing to do with either of us, he said. Something that existed before you needed it, and before I ever walked into that reading room. Like what? I don't know yet, he said, but my family's kept records on everything they were ever afraid of losing. If a fire scared them once, they wrote it down twice. He left before dawn to start calling archivists in 2 states, and I sat at my kitchen table grading nothing, reading nothing, doing the thing I hated most, which was waiting. It was Nolan who solved it in the end, with a document that had nothing to do with me at all. The Whitmore family's fire insurance carrier had gone under decades ago, and its entire historical archive had been donated, long before that, to a business history library 2 states away, a place I'd never had any reason to look, because I hadn't known until 3 days before my defense that the house had partially burned all. The adjuster's inventory, filed 6 weeks after the fire, dated and stamped, sitting in somebody else's archive since before either of our grandparents were born, among the contents of a locked study, 1 sealed case, scientific papers and calculation books, per instruction of E. Whitmore, not to be opened. It couldn't have been planted, it couldn't have been recent. It had been sitting in a library with no connection to me for over half a century before I was born. Dr. Okafor forwarded it to the full committee at 11 that night. She forwarded me something else 40 minutes later, almost as an afterthought, an email from a source she wouldn't name, containing an early, unpublished draft of Preston's book proposal, nearly a year old, with a single unusual phrase in his own handwritten margin notes, the star hand. A phrase I had never said publicly. A phrase that existed nowhere except my private notebook and the restricted department drive Preston should never have opened. Where did this come from? I asked her. A colleague of his had concerns of her own some time ago, she said. She didn't feel safe raising them against someone about to be tenured, not without more than a feeling. I believe tonight gave her more than a feeling. My defense was open to the public, the way defenses always are, and nobody ever comes, except this time, the room was full. Dr. Okafor had, without asking me, invited the department, My parents came because Camille asked them to, still not entirely understanding what they were walking into. Camille came alone. Preston did not come at all, which turned out to be the correct instinct, and also far too late a one. I presented Josephine's calculations for 50 minutes. I presented the ledger, its provenance, the insurance inventory, placing the sealed case in that locked room decades before I was born, in an archive with no connection to me, Nolan, or anyone living. I presented the Star 3 archives, 3 states, one hand. I looked up once, near the end, and found Nolan exactly where he always sat, back row, same seat, coat not yet on, like he was still worried I'd need him to walk me somewhere after. He didn't nod or mouth anything encouraging. He just looked like a man watching something he already knew the ending of, and had known for months, and had never once tried to spoil for me. One committee member, a visiting historian from another university who had clearly been primed by somebody, asked whether it was fair to call a discovery independent when it arrived through what she pointedly called personal channels. The insurance inventory wasn't a personal channel, I said. It's sitting in a business history archive 2 states away, catalogued since 1961, with no connection to me, to Mr. Whitmore, or to this university. I didn't choose where the proof would come from. I just kept looking until I found wherever it was. Nobody asked a follow-up question. Then Dr. Okafor asked me to pause, because there was a related matter the committee felt should be addressed in the same room, in the interest of transparency. A preliminary academic integrity finding regarding unauthorized use of restricted departmental materials and a bad faith complaint, involving a visiting affiliate named Preston Kimball, whose publisher had been formally notified that morning that his current release was under review pending an authorship inquiry. I didn't do that part. I want to be clear, I found Josephine Hale. The department did the rest in daylight in front of witnesses, because that was the only way it would ever actually stick. My mother made a small sound I'd never heard her make before. My father didn't say anything at all. Camille put her hand over her mouth and didn't take it away for a long moment, and when she finally did, she looked at me, really looked, the way you look at someone you're seeing correctly for the first time, and mouthed, silently, across the room, "I'm sorry." When the committee voted unanimously and Dr. Okafor said the word passed out loud, a man in the 3rd row stood to leave quietly before the applause could catch him. My father caught his sleeve. "Whitmore," my father said, reading the sign-in sheet upside down, the way people do when they want to look like they're not reading it at all. "Any relation to the Boston Whitmores? The observatory family?" "Yes, sir," Nolan said. "Elias Whitmore was my great-great-great-grandfather. Nora found the woman he should have credited 140 years ago. I just had the key." My father looked at me the way he'd never once looked at me at Camille's engagement dinner. "You didn't tell us that," he said. "You didn't ask," I said. "You never had to for anything else." Preston's book was pulled from shelves 9 days later, quietly, the way these things go when a publisher wants to avoid a bigger story than the one already unfolding. Camille postponed the wedding, then called it off entirely a few weeks after that, which surprised no one who'd been in that room, and probably surprised her least of all. Camille called me 3 weeks later, the first time she'd called just to talk in longer than either of us wanted to admit. "I keep thinking about the seating chart," she said, out of nowhere. "I was worried about place cards while you were being accused of fraud in front of the entire department." "You didn't know?" "I didn't want to know," she said. "That's different, and it's worse, and I'm sorry it took losing my own wedding to notice the difference." I told her it was okay. It wasn't, not entirely, not yet, but it was the first true thing either of us had said to each other in almost a year, and it felt, for the first time, like something we could actually build on instead of just surviving. My mother invited me to Sunday dinner not long after and, for the first time I could remember, asked before we sat down, "What do you actually want to eat, Nora? Not what's easy. What do you want?" It was a small question. It undid me a little the way small questions do when you've waited your whole life for someone to ask them. Nolan came with me to that dinner, sat across from my father, didn't say much and didn't need to. Later in his kitchen, he set 2 plain sandwiches on the counter, nothing special, nothing that would ever photograph well, nothing anyone would put in a book, and slid one across to me and ran his thumb once, lightly over the cover of Josephine's notebook, which sat between us now like a third guest at every meal we'd have from then on. "She got her name back," he said. "So did I said, and meant something slightly different by it, and he knew exactly which meaning I meant. I did not have to earn my seat at that table, I never will again. Did she go far enough or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.